Hey there, young historians. You've recently been going over what life was like for African Americans in the mid 1800s, and I just want to review over all of it with you now, give you the key ideas, the key topics, make sure that it's all right up here in your head for you. So here we go. African Americans in the mid 1800s. The essential question we were answering during this entire topic was, how did African Americans face slavery and discrimination in the mid 1800s? Really, just how did they endure it and how did they survive it? We started by talking about the differences between the North and the South and the slave and the free. So a question would be something like this. What were the facts and experiences of enslaved people, free blacks in the North and free blacks in the South? And so I've now just got a chart here that shows you what those three categories would be like. So the facts and experiences of enslaved people would be that they were considered legal property. That means they could be bought, they could be sold, just like farm machinery or livestock. Enslaved people could not own anything or buy anything, and they worked on farms or plantations. Well, what about the facts and experiences of free blacks living in the South? Even though this was rare, there were people that were in this category. They worked as laborers, craftspeople, so maybe like carpenters, or household servants. They were forbidden to own guns. That's because whites in the South were afraid of African Americans having guns at that time. They could not travel freely. In fact, if they were seen walking about, they might actually be arrested and put into slavery. And they were not allowed to work certain jobs. Okay, what about free blacks living in the North then? Well, they still experienced discrimination. That means unfair or unequal treatment. They were denied the right to vote. They had trouble finding jobs, especially good-paying ones. They lived under the policies of segregation, which means separation in public places. And they started their own churches, schools, and self-help organizations so they could actually endure or survive discrimination. All right, so the economics of slavery was the next topic. And really it's because slavery was, in fact, an economic system. It was created because of money, the almighty dollar, right? So this is true that the great majority of white Southerners did not own slaves. It was actually a pretty small percentage. So why did the South remain so loyal to slavery? I want to make sure that we understand that just because the great majority of white Southerners did not own slaves, it wasn't necessarily because they felt that it was wrong. It's because it cost money to purchase humans. It cost money, and a lot of Southerners couldn't afford it. So what we see on this map here, kind of a nice overlay of the agriculture that existed in the North and the South, and you can see across the South all those little white popcorns, it looks like. Well, those little white puffs there, that's all cotton. And you can see down here it matches over perfectly with where there was large enslaved populations. So we know that cotton and agriculture had a big part of the economics of slavery. So the economy of the South depended on cotton, and cotton planters depended on slave labor to grow their crops. Well, other Southerners that maybe did not own enslaved people, they understood that the economy of the South depended on slave labor. And if they removed the slave labor, then it would collapse. The economy would collapse. They realized that even if they were a carpenter, people who purchased their carpentry work probably were making their money in some way attached to slavery. All right, so we move on from the economics of slavery to now what are the living and working conditions. And for each of these topics, you're going to see an image here first that gives you a little bit of a clue to answering these questions. So how would you describe the working conditions of enslaved people, and what examples can you give? Well, enslaved people worked from morning till late at night. Some slaves worked in the fields, while others worked in the house. Some of them were skilled seamstresses. That means they were good at sewing with needles and thread and fabric. They were carpenters, or they were blacksmiths. Blacksmiths work with metals. And enslaved people started working at the age of 6. There was a phrase that was known around the slave population that was slave young, slave long. Living conditions. How did owners view their enslaved people? Describe the homes of enslaved people? Did enslaved people go hungry? And describe the medical conditions of enslaved people. All All right, so we got a little hint there, that image, and here's some answers for us. They were viewed as property that could be bought and sold. Their homes were often crowded and like these rough, crude cabins, like you see in this image here. Very cold in the winter, very hot in the summer. They ate cornmeal, bacon, molasses, food from gardens and hunting. It was pretty rare, actually, that slaves were hungry. They often were able to get pretty hefty meals, but that's because the more food that they had, or I guess if they were well fed, they'd be able to work much longer. And it was actually seen as being pretty cruel to have your enslaved people go hungry. Other slave owners might look at somebody else and say, oh, you can't even afford to feed your enslaved people? You must be pretty poor yourself. So it's kind of a status thing as well. And the medical conditions? Well, enslaved people actually received some medical treatment. It was pretty poor still, but probably better than a lot of the white population because those slave owners had an investment into their enslaved people, meaning they wanted to make sure they were healthy so they could continue working. The next topic is a pretty difficult image to look at. I'm going to show you anyway, though. This one is all about controlling enslaved people. The questions are, what type of punishment was used to control their enslaved people? Why would overseers avoid savage beatings? And this right here would be an example of a savage beating. And what did owners do when a more extreme form of control was desired? So what we're seeing in this image is the result of a man who's been whipped by a leather whip that might have had maybe fish hooks or shards of rock or glass attached to the end. And when the whip hit his back, it would actually pull the skin or the flesh from his bones. Pretty cruel to see and to think about. So when talking about controlling enslaved people, owners' methods included beating, whipping, and branding enslaved people. To brand means to take like a hot piece of metal and actually burn the skin. Keeping enslaved people ignorant and dependent was also a way that they controlled them, and instilling fear in them. They avoided savage beatings like the one we saw in that image because they still needed them to work, and if they were too badly injured, they couldn't work. And when a more extreme form of control was desired, they might send an enslaved person to a slave breaker who was an extremely cruel person that really physically punished those enslaved people. Next was resistance to slavery. How did enslaved people resist and fight back against slavery? Well, they did this in two ways: passive forms and aggressive forms. And then the next question is, what method was used most often? So you're seeing an image there that gives us a little bit of a hint. Let's think about the passive forms and aggressive forms. Passive means not active, or the opposite of aggressive. So you could passively break tools. If the tools are broken, then they wouldn't have to work. They sometimes worked sloppily. They intentionally did bad work. They'd act dumb or sick, like they couldn't figure out something to avoid work. Or they refused orders. There was an example of a man who pretended to be blind for years so that he could get out of a lot of work. An aggressive form would be that they ran away with the help of the Underground Railroad. They escaped to the north, and sometimes they flat out revolted violently, as in the case of Nat Turner's rebellion, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The method that was used most often, passive resistance, could be common, or was more common because it could be used daily. Tools could be broken, fences could be damaged, work could be sloppy, they could refuse orders, act dumb or sick every day without getting into too much trouble. So when talking about running away with the help of the Underground Railroad, we're talking about this. The Underground Railroad is not technically a railroad like you'd think about a train, and it's not even technically underground, like under the earth. It was just a secret network of blacks and some sympathetic whites that wanted to help enslaved people escape to the north. So it might be on occasion like underground tunnels or dugout holes. Oftentimes the places they would hide would be in homes or in basements, maybe in tree trunks. So just hidden little passageways and hidden places that they could go to go point to point to get to the north, especially the northern part of the United States. But sometimes they would travel on the Underground Railroad all the way north to Canada. One of the most famous conductors of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. You've maybe heard of her before. She was an escaped enslaved person herself, and she escaped to the North and could have stayed in the North. However, she traveled back to the South numerous times, maybe over 20 times, to bring groups of escaped people to the North. She would bring large groups, and she was known to have saved maybe 50, 80, 100 people and get them into freedom. And she was known as a conductor. Okay, I mentioned Nat Turner's rebellion before. Nat Turner was an enslaved person who resisted slavery. He organized a violent rebellion where him and a group of his Confederates got together, got a bunch of weapons, and they killed at least 57 whites in this rebellion. Neither rebelling or escaping would be the most common, though, form of resistance. Remember, it would be passive resistance. The next topic had to do with families. How were families legally viewed, and how did enslaved people rebel against that view? And what did enslaved people fear the most? So we got a little image there that would give us a hint. Well, families were illegal. They did not exist by law. However, most enslaved families were headed by a mother and a father, and the parents still made sure they taught valuable lessons to their children. They taught them lessons like survival, respecting themselves, respecting other members of the enslaved community, especially their elders. And the biggest fear of enslaved people was not being punished, whipped, branded, or even killed. It was being sold apart from family. That would be the hardest experience to endure. Next up was leisure time or free time. When did enslaved people get leisure time? And what did they do during this free time? So we can see an image there that gives us a hint. And the answer to these two questions would be Saturday night into Sunday was for leisure time or free time. And the types of activities, often they would try to mix work with play. So something like a quilting bee would be making a physical quilt, that would be work, but doing this in a group where you could talk and maybe laugh and maybe sing together. Corn husking parties, so that's peeling the outer leaves and husk off of a corn. Singing and dancing, telling tales, so stories, myths perhaps, hunting and fishing, going to church and playing games. The next topic was considered like churches or invisible churches. So what did churches do for enslaved people? And why was the idea of churches being invisible important for enslaved people? So we've got an image there. Let's answer those two questions. Churches gave voice to enslaved people's longings, their desires, their sorrows, and their desire for freedom. It gave them an opportunity to vocally voice these feelings. And it was important that they were invisible because it was the one place where enslaved people could come together to share in their hardships without being watched by their masters. They could do this in secret, and they could talk about things that they didn't want their masters to overhear. The last topic was African American culture. And the question was really what aspects of African American life had roots in African culture. And so, quilts, as we've seen now, contained African images such as animals and environments. Spirituals, those are songs. They were used for African rhythms and harmonies to express oppression, being controlled. The dances of enslaved people were based on African traditions, and stories incorporated African legends and folktales. So there's a lot of aspects of African American life that had roots in African culture. Artwork, spirituals, dances, music, songs, and stories. Okay, now we're going to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk to you about primary sources versus secondary sources. This is important for historians to understand, and it's going to help us with our next activity. So this is primary source versus secondary source. A primary source is the immediate first-hand account of a topic. It's from a person who had a direct connection with it. It is the first-hand experience. The person who is telling us about it witnessed it. They saw this thing happen. Some examples of primary sources would be the texts of laws and other original documents, newspaper reports by reporters who actually were at the event, or if they're quoting people who did witnessed the event. A speech or a diary or a letter or an interview, it's what the people involved said or wrote. Original research, photographs and video or audio that capture an event, those are all primary source documents. Well, secondary source would be secondhand. They're one step removed from the primary source. They often quote or otherwise use primary sources. They can cover the same topic, but they really are interpreting or analyzing the original topic or the original source. So some examples of secondary sources would be like a book about a topic, including a textbook. The textbook we use for this class is a secondary source. Now, it might have a couple of images or quotes, but most of the book is written by someone who was not in attendance. It was written by someone who did not witness the speech given by Dr. King, or who did not witness the events of the Civil War. They're based on the primary sources. An analysis or an interpretation of the data. Documentaries. If you've ever watched a documentary, it might have videos or photos, but those documentaries are then interpreted by the person who's creating the documentary. So primary source is firsthand. Secondary source would be one step removed. There could also be tertiary sources, third. Okay, so a couple of practice then, a couple of examples. My diary, the one that I write and keep under my pillowcase at night, or under my pillow at night, would that be a primary or secondary? News reporter that's reporting from a sporting event. They are there and they're reporting about what they're seeing. And then your textbook. Okay, for those three, it would be primary, and secondary. Hope you got those right. Someone posting a photo on Instagram. Hashtag no filter. They took the photo, they posted it. Your friend telling you about a car accident they were in. Is that primary or secondary? And the school yearbook. See how you did? That'd be primary. Posting the photo, they took it, primary. Your friend telling you about their experience, primary. The school yearbook is all photos and images from the year, so that's primary. Okay, last three. A documentary on the History Channel. A photograph of a historical event. And a student writing a report based on what they've learned. That would be secondary, primary, and secondary. Documentaries are secondary, photographs, primary, and student writing a report based on what they've learned. They learned those things from other things, so that's secondary. Okay, so this topic was African Americans in the mid-1800s. The question was, how did African Americans face slavery and discrimination in the mid-1800s? You are now going to actually use some primary sources, and you're going to interpret what they are, what they mean, and match them up with another image. So you're going to hear a quotation and an image, and you're going to be matching those two up. Okay, thanks for sticking with me. I know this was kind of a long video, but it went through a lot of information. It was a really important review for us to understand. Okay, good luck with the matching. See ya.